Hello, everyone. My name is Pico del Hierro-Villa. I'm a non-binary Chicanx artist from El Paso, Texas, but I am currently getting my master's in the Chicanx Studies Department at the University of New Mexico. My art focus is on mixing photography with testimonials that uplift queer political struggles and queering cultural iconographies. In this presentation, I will be talking about past queer Chicana feminist work that has created the opportunities and knowledge I and many others have today of deconstructing hegemonic powers within Mexican/Chicano traditional cultural values. So the purpose of this presentation is to highlight and show how queer Chicana feminists have been at the foreground of creating counter movements and narratives to challenge Western ideologies by exposing the violence they have inflicted upon communities through heteronormative forces. So as history has progressed, these oppositional endeavors have created different outlets of expressing resistance towards violent Western and colonial standards like hegemonic masculinity, binary gender roles, and heterosupremacy over queer identities. I also show that with queer Chicana feminist work, I have been able to create different approaches to display and confront queer Chicana and Chicanx struggles, like machismo and homophobia through an intersectional lens that includes gender, race, and sexuality in my art, which challenges Mexican and Chicano traditional cultural values and cultural iconographies. So a little bit about me and my background with art and Chicana feminism. So as a queer Chicanx feminist, I've always found it necessary to incorporate the self and political identity into the work that I do. So I've always been surrounded by a lot of creative influences like my dad's and my uncles and my tias. So they introduced me to artists like Salvador Dali and Mexican muralist Diego Rivera. I was really fascinated by their work, but I was really never invested into it because of certain reasons. And one day, my tia brought home a knockoff painting of Los Dos Fridas, which is displayed right here, and from the El Bronco swap meet in El Paso. And I was very, very, very intrigued by it. And so, though I understand that Frida is problematic, I also acknowledge that she did a lot to change how women are viewed in the art realm. So Frida Kahlo was a queer communist who exhibited her intersectional identity into her paintings that presented an artistic mode that I found to be very, very interesting. Her style of painting represented the ethos of colonized women that created a background story of pain, but uplifted the resistance and strength learned through suffering. So Frida Kahlo was an example of placing background and the personal into art. So that also acted as a counter method of male and white colonial dominance. So as I grew older and became more familiar with Chicana feminism and Chicana feminist art, I carried my work with more intent to counteract against negative performances of hegemony. Like Frida, I wanted to not only create, but also recreate the stories of women and femmes within the Mexican/Chicano community, building on the resilience to the static pictures of suffering. I wanted my art to represent more than the basic cultural representation, but something new that was continuously in the making and that was presenting healthy feminist practices and ideologies. With doing so, it was also important to recognize the framework of Chicana feminist literature and art to honor their work and efforts in providing this critical material. But before we get into all of that, let's first define what a cultural iconography is. So a cultural iconography is basically a visual depiction that provides cultural representational context. So La Virgen, Pancho Villa. So basically a cultural icon that when people see these images of La Virgen or La Pancho Villa, they automatically associate it with the Chicanx, Latinx, Mexican community. So now what does queer and cultural iconography mean? So to answer this, I'm going to provide the answer through some steps. So first is Chela Sandoval's ideological terms to present my framework. Then the historical / theoretical points, going into Chicano literature and art as counter-hegemonic tools. Then last, my artwork. So I present my framework through two ideological terms by Chicana feminist Chela Sandoval, which also presents a framework queer Chicana feminists have used in both their writing and art that further reflects the deconstruction of hegemonic power. So the first one being oppositional consciousness. And oppositional consciousness, which Sandoval describes as mapping of consciousness in opposition to the dominant social order, which charged the white and hegemonic feminist histories of consciousness. So oppositional consciousness has become a pride model in Chicana feminist work, thus creating outlets that have deconstructed traditional and heteronormative toxic values in the Chicano / Mexican community. The second term I employ is Sandoval's definition, meta-ideologizing. So meta-ideologizing represents how Chicana feminists and myself have restructured cultural iconographies to create new concepts and stories. So Chela Sandoval describes meta-ideologizing as the operation of appropriating dominant ideological forms and using them in a whole and in order to transform their meanings into a new imposed and revolutionary concept. Moreover, I will be presenting the historical endeavors and traumas that motivated queer Chicana feminist work through these four components. So the first one, the Chicanos movement monolithic strategy for Chicana liberation. The second one, how heteronormativity has created hegemonic power. The third one, how colonization has implemented toxic traditional values about women into our culture. And the last, how I have applied Chicana feminism when it comes to both oppositional consciousness and meta-ideologizing into my own artwork. So to discuss the Chicanos movement monolithic strategy, I talk about what I call the Chicano movement. So in the 1960s, a movement sparked an oppositional stance against the US, which functioned as an empire that targeted racialized minorities and inflicted them into the violence of a police state and more. The mobilization of intergenerational Mexican Americans and Mexican immigrants led to what we know now as the Chicano movement. Chicanos and Chicanas were viewed as invisible minorities who struggled to obtain functioning educational systems and everyday living conditions. From Los Angeles to Chicago, where there was a heavy presence of Chicanos and Chicanas and Mexican immigrants, oppressed peoples decided to take matters into their own hands, and a political struggle that fought for various issues like farm workers' rights, anti-assimilation, exploitation, and police brutality evolved. As the movement progressed, Chicanas, Chicanos formed a sense of unity, which they called La Raza Unida, a brotherhood and sisterhood that was an important factor for trust and movement building, but ended up creating a pluralistic lens that soon made queer Chicanas and non-queer Chicanas leave, making a new renaissance of ideologies and tactics flourish in the field of feminism. So women in the movement were expected to work in roles that were considered to be piddling and subordinate to the men doing all the frontline work. When Chicanas presented the issues that were impacting women in the Chicano movement, many traditional Chicanas, Chicanos pushed back saying it wasn't part of their core beliefs It would damage the focus of fighting for everyone's struggles and not just one subgroup. While the women's movement was gaining momentum around the same time, Chicanas began to critique the ways they were being treated and challenge the white heteronormative framework fueling their oppressions. There was a rejection to the white women's liberation movement and a statement for the Chicanas trying to organize towards gender equality and queer rights. A year later, at the Raza Unida Convergent, Chicanas took the stage to advocate for equal representation, where they were called vendidas, aka traitors to the movement. And they were also asked to leave. As Chicana feminists started to disperse from the movement to enter into different political strategies and modes of production that encompassed women's struggles, once more they were challenged by homogeneity. Sorry, that is a very difficult word for me to pronounce. The women's liberation movement, also known as the second wave of feminism, was a white restrictive space in that it focused primarily on the binary of men versus women. When women of color struggles were thrown into a multicultural understanding of race, making no room for a broader intersectional lens on race, class, and genders. White women's sisterhood, like Chicana and Chicanos, La Raza Unida, became another issue and only allowed for women in these organizing spaces to focus on women's issues, which were primarily impacting white women. It wasn't until the late 1970s to early 80s when This Bridge Called My Back and the Mishkiawala letters and more Chicana literature was being published was when multiple manifestos became accessible to start leading Chicanas into a direction that was specifically constructed for their intersectional political beliefs. So I went ahead and included a quote from Cheri Moraga, though Cheri Moraga is a bit problematic when it comes to including non-binary genders. I did find this quote to be very relating to what I just spoke about. So she says, I come from a long line of vendidas. And so by saying that, it's not only a reclamation of the, word, which basically means backstabbing, but it's also saying that I come from a long line of women who didn't put up with machismo and toxic masculinity. And then I also have This Bridge Called My Back, which really was a turning point in queer Chicana literature. So next we have heteronormativity as a pillar of hegemonic power. And then we have Felix Dion's Joteria Loteria. I 100% recommend looking him up on Instagram and also buying his work as well. So Chicanas who took the route of feminism and also queerness were said to be anti-family because they were seen as trying to destroy the heterosexual and patriarchal structure that placed them under men and being subjected to only traditional labor-focused work. So watching the kids, having kids, basically being a housewife. So we can see this as a heteronormative issue. So heterosexuality in the context of queer theory is not classified as merely an identifier of sexual preference, but rather a way of thinking and doing, and it's termed as heteronormativity. Also, heterosexuality in the US has been structured through hegemonic regimes, constructing everyday violence and submission, which is also termed as heteronormativity. So heteronormativity as hegemony works in favor of the state to keep social order and norms that reflect the average nuclear family, which includes having a job that occupies the main part of our lifetime, capitalism, getting married to someone of the opposite sex, a marriage between a man and a woman, and considering sexuality as private. Also, it includes the affirming existence of violent institutions like prisons, jails, and all that. So all of this displays heteronormativity and hegemonic power. So an important term that really describes the family dynamics that many Chicanos and Chicanas were worried about preserving, so the traditional family. So the term is called family as an ideological apparatus. So family as an ideological apparatus, a term developed by Marxist theorist Louis Althusser, states that men and women are placed into the categories of dominator and dominated. So the dominator men, dominated being women, displaying heteronormativity as a hegemonic form of power that affects women. So there's this book that incorporates family as an ideological apparatus, and it's by Allison Assister, and it's called Althusser and Feminism. And in this book, she describes the oppression of women in a family from a biological standpoint of being fitted to bear children automatically leads to inequality because they're now only being seen as child rearing agents. So in this description, we can see the idea of women being made into commodities only to perform the production of children and serving men, aka the owners. Also aka women only being seen as owned property. There's another important reading, and it's by Connell, and I'm going to butcher this last name, but it's Messerschmitt, and it's called Hegemonic Masculinities. So it further explains how domination functions through heteronormativity by presenting the concept of hierarchical masculinity. So hegemonic masculinity, which originally began in the US with the violence that was inflicted upon gay men through homophobia, is considered to be the utilization of power to exert dominance over women and can only be attained by cisgender heterosexual white males with socioeconomic capital. So as working class men and other men of color wanted to gain access to hegemonic masculinity, in which I believe so that they could reap the benefits of white supremacy, capital, and power, protesting masculinity, a term used in the reading, is now adopted by these working class men and men of color. So it's basically a lesser form of hegemonic masculinity. And protesting masculinity now becomes somewhat of a form of hegemonic masculinity, but without the benefits of economic resources and institutional authority. Specifically in the Chicano/Mexican community, protesting masculinity has taken the form of machismo. The performance of machismo sustains sexist and violent actions that are imposed upon all non-men, creating hyper-feminine and hyper-masculine dichotomies that feeds into the patriarchal order. So we can think of machismo as a way that something that men perform so that they can feel like they have some sort of power. So this is what affected Chicanas in the movement during the 60s and what Chicanx and Chicana people are still facing today. So the picture on the slide that I included is by Idusol Gonzalez, and it's titled Machismo #1, created in 2019. And this is what she has to say about her piece. And also the reason why I chose this is because it relates to heteronormativity as a pillar of hegemonic power. So Idusol Gonzalez says about her piece, the woman's identity doesn't matter, which is why her face is covered by tape. She's behind the curtain because she's not allowed to interact with the audience or even look at them. Her focus is solely on him. He is free from the background and able to interact with the audience as he pleases. In direct contrast to the woman, you see the man framed in an intricate golden halo because he was born a saint. Women, however, must earn their halos. Even then, they are still not as powerful as men. So as you can see from this piece and what this piece means, men and machismo, toxic masculinity, is something that is highly praised within the Chicano/Mexican community and something that is even seen as cultural. So now we go into Chicana literature and art as counter-hegemonic tools. So the claiming of the body of a Chicana and the determination of her functionality is a byproduct of colonialism. Women's autonomy in the Chicano/Mexican culture is a concept that has deep roots in how colonizers have asserted their superiority through the Catholic religion. The secular response to women's actions has created a binary of both good and evil, two constraining paths that only allow women to seek motherhood or a life of adultery and sin. A duality is created of appropriate functions that are linked to La Virgen de Guadalupe and non-appropriate functions that are linked to Malintzin, known today as Malinche. So this particular action has constrained the way Chicano/Mexican culture and values can allow women and femmes to flourish and work outside of these binaries that functions only to create submissive roles. Chicanas have long struggled with the identification through these two, La Virgen and Malinche, cultural iconographies, because it destines their path, pressuring and leaving them with no ability to seek beyond the virgin and whore narratives. As we saw with the Chicano movement, Chicanas were destined for servitude to the Catholic religion and their men. As times and struggles passed, many Chicanas were not satisfied with the historical violence and war on women and femmes' bodies. So they created a new struggle, art forms, and a renaissance of literature that paved the way for Chicana sexual liberation and autonomy. The binary of La Virgen and Malinche were now being challenged, critiqued, and analyzed to provide counter-hegemonic tools to Chicana and Chicanx feminist praxis, allowing us to leave behind the narratives that were holding many back and showed how these cultural icons can become reinterpreted through literature and art. So before we go into literature and art, I want to talk a little bit more about the Virgen/Malinche binary because it's so important because it really sets the ground in how women are created in this dichotomy, and it's either you can end up like La Virgen, who's pure, or you can end up like Malinche, who is basically, a whore. Even though in my eyes she's not, but in our traditional cultural values, that's the way we see her. So Octavio Paz, a poet and essayist, presents an argument that Malinche and Cortés are more than historical figures, but also a symbolization of our living attitude of how we create standards for both men and women in our culture. A lot of the anger that people hold in our culture is towards Malinche. She was a sellout, she was a whore. But where's the direct anger against Cortés? Chicanas are called Malinches in certain situations, but are Chicanos ever called Cortés? No. So Paz's argument and reinterpretation both analyze the misogyny in response to masculine visualizations of women historically and in present time. So in present time, this also relates not only to women, but also femmes as well. Malinche represents the overall attitude that is held in the Chicano/Mexican culture towards women in any moment, whether they are independent of the situation or whether they are victims. Because as we know, Malinche was sold into slavery and was forced to partner with Cortés as an act of survival. So Chicanos tend to side with the male nationalistic values when it comes to Malinche, placing their favoritism with La Virgen de Guadalupe, who is to them a symbol of silence. If we analyze the representation of La Virgen, we can point out many attributes that reflect how women are perceived within the Chicano culture. As mentioned previously, Chicanas during the movement faced toxic situations of being silenced and being labeled as vendidas, and even Malinches for deviating away from traditional cultural practices. So these Chicanas were going against the representation of subversion, so being under male power, and becoming victims of moments they could not control. Chicanos felt a direct conflict of having to fill these traditional roles and functions. It was creating barriers with their creativity and inventiveness, as well as their desire to transform their cultural roles and redefine themselves. So this image that I included in the slide, it talks about a piece that I'm going to talk about in my next slide, but it's a book called Our Lady of Our Controversy, and it goes over Ama Lopez's piece, Our Lady. And once again, I 100% recommend reading it. So now for the literature and art. So two specific Chicana feminist pieces that have personally influenced my ability to obtain a counter-hegemonic consciousness when it came to like my self-direction were Sandra Cisneros' essay called Guadalupe the Sex Goddess and Ama Lopez's digital piece Our Lady, which is displayed right here. So both pieces have become a tool that reflects both oppositional consciousness and meta-ideologizing. So the two terms that I presented in the beginning. And so they both utilize traditional material to counter hegemonic power that dominates the Chicana and her sexuality embodied by transforming the image of La Virgen into a liberated, colonized woman instead of this silent figure. So in Cisneros' essay, Guadalupe, the Sex Goddess, she reflects on how her encounters with shame that revolved around the negative association she had towards her body and the lack of access of sex-positive rhetoric. She mentions how guilt is a major factor that has left young women with the inability to gain sexual confidence because of how Chicano/Mexican culture is structured. So Cisneros in this essay provides a juxtaposition of La Virgen and how she represents the modest Chicana perspective. So in her essay, she says, "This is why I was angry for so many years. Every time I saw a La Virgen de Guadalupe, my cultural role model for brown women like me. She was damn dangerous, an ideal so lofty and unrealistic it was laughable. Did boys have to aspire to be Jesus? I never saw any evidence of it. They were fornicating like rabbits while the church ignored them and pointed us women towards our destiny, marriage and motherhood. The other alternative was putahood." So like I mentioned before, it's either you go get married, have children until you get married, or you become a puta. So as Cisneros documents her growth in her essay in finding freedom through the action of self-love and sex, her perception of La Virgen changes as well. La Virgen de Guadalupe was now a mirror of the Aztec goddess that represented putahood and resistance towards male dominance. Again, she says, "La Lupe as cabrona, not silent and passive, but silently gathering force." Now we go to Ama Lopez's piece, cyber piece, Our Lady. So Our Lady was a part of one of the first digital art exhibitions nationwide and was featured at the Museum of International Folk Art in Santa Fe, New Mexico. So the curator of Cyber Arte at MOIFA recognized Ama Lopez's work and other Chicanas who were a part of the exhibition for their recast of traditional folks and cultural iconographies because they reflected 21st century feminist values. So Our Lady was a reformation of La Virgen of Guadalupe that represented the pre-colonial and present resistance of the Chicana. The piece consists of a woman in a floral bikini being held by another woman whose breasts are exposed. She's wearing a cloak with Mexica symbols. 3 weeks later, after the opening of Cyber Arte in Santa Fe, New Mexico, 2 males, a police chaplain, and community activists, along with other local religious community affiliates, visited the museum to demand that Lopez's piece be taken down immediately because it represented La Virgen in a very sacrilegious and offensive way. Amo Lopez's work continued to cause an uproar in many other religious communities, including California, for her reinterpretation of La Virgen, and it was eventually taken down at Moifa. So again, we can see how La Virgen is viewed in a very, very modest way. So Cisneros and Lopez's pieces constitute the process of dismantling the colonial framework that has placed hegemonic power over the Chicanas' ability to produce assurance in their sexuality and their body. The representation of La Virgen has become the epitome of what women should achieve to be. A body that cannot be imagined with the abilities to reproduce unless the miracle of a man comes along. This image has placed a toxic vision upon the community, perpetuating heteronormative standards for women and femmes who wish to be liberated. Both meta-ideologizing and oppositional consciousness has allowed for La Virgen and Malinche to become independent from the church, allowing the ability to take on a form that is decolonized and autonomous. So as I mentioned, this is Ama Lopez's piece, Our Lady. Personally, I love this piece. Ama Lopez is a Chicana artist, queer Chicana artist that actually inspired me to really think about how I want to form my art. It's just super amazing, and like I said, folks should really read Our Lady of Resistance to learn more about what this piece represents and how much of an uproar it caused. So now with all this information, let's get into querying cultural iconographies like a Chicanx feminist. So about a year ago, I wanted to revitalize my passion in doing creative work, so art. So I started doing photography and recently started working with Photoshop. So I saw that there was a need for queer Chicanx Latinx representation and wanted to provide something that was experimental and unconventional. So when I say Chicanx Latinx representation, I mean including non-binary and genderqueer representation. So when getting into photography, I was inspired by the impact visual representation has on people, because it really triggers this like emotional psychology, and it can really help create these, dialogues that can lead to educational movements and social change. So I wanted to combine different outlets of queer ideologies, since they are typically provided through an extensive and jargon literature that is Euro-focused and non-accessible. I know in my presentation, I was using a lot of jargon, but specifically when talking about my art, I like to make it as accessible as possible. So the way I approached my work was to provide some sort of conversation testimonials from individuals or anything that I'm photographing. So with every photo I take, I make sure to include a semi-structured interview, or at least a small description to show what this photo represents, to stay with my framework of wanting to create dialogue and possibly social change when people see my work. Also that I am inspired by Chicana feminist work. I too want to take the concepts of oppositional consciousness and meta-ideologizing further by incorporating a queer, trans, non-binary position into my work. With this, I include a wide range of genders, into my art to counteract against the idea of femininity and masculinity and who gets to claim it, including the concept of mixing them together or the position of neutrality where gender does not exist at all. Um, showing the process of decolonization through queering cultural identities and cultural values in our community. So the position I take is also dedicated to the historical concept of gender pre-colonization, pre-conquest. Third, fourth, fifth gendered people used to be held at such a high esteem. We still exist today, but many of us still face prejudice actions due to the way that colonization has been incorporated into the concept of like the gender binary. So in my work, the juxtaposition of queerness creates a contrast and questioning of relations. Normative identities and ideas are then warped and recreated. For example, femininity is equal to saints, while masculinity is related to power. When creating a contrast that interferes with a traditional cultural value like femininity and masculinity, it deconstructs the originality of a concept, making people question the work. I do this with critical queer Chicana feminism in mind, and I call this queering cultural iconographies. Not to say that people like Ama Lopez, Cisneros, and people were not queering cultural iconographies before, but the word queer did not exist back then. So now I'm taking not only my work and the other work of Chicanx Latinx people in the present, but also the work of LGBTQ Latinx Chicana people in the past, and what they're doing. I just call it queering cultural iconographies. So to provide more of an example of my work, I'm going to be talking about 3 of my pieces. So right now, this is one of my pieces, and it's a little project that I'm doing that you can check out on my Instagram, which I'll talk about later. So my first piece is called Llorona. So I captured this photo at the border highway in El Paso, Texas, at the port of entry 40. So port of entry 40 is, like I said, along the border highway. And it used to be actually open. So back then, people basically could just cross back and forth to Mexico and the US. But then now we have Border Patrol, border customs agents and all that. But if you haven't been to El Paso, the Rio Grande runs all along where this metal fence is. So growing up in the lower valley, right next to the border, and being from a family of immigrants, I have not personally experienced border violence firsthand, but I have definitely seen it. So I really wanted to capture a piece that represented my family's and the people of the lower valley's experience living in the lower valley right next to the border. And I wanted to include my own testimonial as well that accompanies the photo. And I call this testimonial Reimagining La Llorona, Looking to the Border Crisis. And I say, oral stories are used to teach children about what some may call mythical creatures, sightings, creations of life on Earth, and valuable lessons. For the story of La Llorona, she was an example of a tragedy who teaches us never to disobey our mothers and why we couldn't be out so late playing in the streets. As many of us Chicana, Chicano, Chicanx feminists who grew up with her became older, some decided to recreate her story. La Llorona has been reinterpreted into different entities and meanings. Our outlet to our art and creations have been inspired by the women who have been victimized. We were tired of hearing stories where women became saints, lifeless bodies, or an item. The legend of La Llorona allows oncoming generations to mold the story of pain and compare it to our modern reality. Her story has been reclaimed by Chicana feminists and queer Chicanx people, being turned into liberated art, songs, and creative writings. Our stories of the women tied down by her children, husband, and more, have been warped into social issues women are facing and fighting against in the present day. The radical conceptualization of occupying forces amongst marginalized bodies is something Chicana, Chicanx artists, and writers has allowed us to find our freedom in. Growing up half a mile away from the Rio Grande border, La Llorona was a mujer who was a threat to the lower valley area. The tale I remember was from my mother. She told me she was a mother too, who went insane and drowned both of her niños. And every night you could hear her weeping and see her walking down the river. If you don't behave, she would come and get you. Si no te portas bien, La Llorona te va a venir a buscar. I believe this tale to be true, especially since my tias and tios would tell me my mom used to see her dead abuela sitting in the hallway watching our family. The sighting of a spirit or entity wasn't ever something that was labeled as mythical or folklore in my family, so I took La Llorona very seriously. Every night when I was outside trying to see her from my front yard, I would see the field lights turn on at the border and would see Border Patrol cars parked nearby. Border Patrol was no stranger to our neighborhood or my childhood. Every day, they would patrol the neighborhood, and on bad days, they would try to intrude in the privacy of your own home. The home I lived in was my abuela's, and that's where my mom, my brother, and I stayed. Once in a while, my abuela, who passed away when I was 16, would assist families hiding in her bushes or backyard who just crossed the border. And as mad as others got, she said she could never let her people suffer and be taken away. The presence of Border Patrol and the violent stories I would hear happen at the border always made me wonder. They're occupying our area all day and night. They should have seen La Llorona by now, que no? Were they ordered just to ignore her or drive miles away from the Rio for the hours she was present so nothing bad would happen? Was La Llorona a woman who mourned more than her children? Was she crying for more than the river she drowned her children in? As I grew older and the border crisis and violence in the two sister cities began to wreak havoc, I began to make the connections. The spirit of La Llorona did not live in the river, but she lived in the people who were victims of violence. She lived in women, children, trans people, parents, and even men. And who was causing all this weeping? If it wasn't this woman, it was Border Patrol, trans misogyny, US intervention, colonization, and overall violence. The weeping was now heard all day and all night, and it came from the women in Mexico mourning all those lost from the femicides. It came from parents being torn away from their children to be put into internment camps. It came from the trans mujeres doing sex work near the crossing point into Mexico, being murdered and wishing society would accept them one day. It came from the people who crossed the border, who were found in homes, parks, and buildings, wondering if they would be caught. It came from deported mothers, fathers whose children didn't even know they were deported because they were at school getting the educations their parents wanted from them. And it came from me and my community who grew up witnessing border violence and screaming as loud so others could hear our pain and rise up. La Llorona was no longer a story of a mother who mourned her sins, and Border Patrol weren't the only ones who could see her, because I can see her when I walk out my door. I can see her in the tents near downtown El Paso. I can see her on the news, and I can see her in the mirror. The history of the crying woman by the river has been co-opted by the occupational violence in the US and Latin America. The US nation state has created the refugee crisis, split identities, and more, in which they will not alleviate the conditions they created. I believe hybridity, rather than abolishing a division to only create another one between people is what I feel can truly liberate and stop the painful sobbing. La Llorona is now the story and motivation of liberation. So with this testimonial and this photo, like I mentioned, I really wanted to capture, the border violence that I grew up with a lot of people that I knew grew up with, and just the violence that is being inflicted upon. I don't like to say immigrants, I like to say refugees, because their conditions were specifically created by US intervention. So I definitely wanted to create something that helped people understand how horrible and violent immigration customs is in the US. My second piece is a digital piece called Pancha La Putex. So this is more of like a lighter piece. So Pancha La Putex incorporates the process of engendering while facing machismo. Though I admire Pancho Villa for his revolutionary actions against the US empire, Pancho Villa was still a participant in toxic masculinity. He was considered to be like muy hombre for the fact of having like multiple women lovers and not being able to be contained. And he like consistently upkept his like macho poise. So in this digital piece, I wanted to degrade the idea of machismo masculinity by presenting Pancho Villa as a genderqueer figure who took pride in their putahood with multiple people of various genders and sexualities. So instead of Pancho Villa being muy macho and having the sexual life with women, now Pancho Villa is this non-binary figure who is a puta and engages in, their sexual liberation with many people other than cisgender women. Though a simple piece, the idea of a macho icon revolutionary figure in lipstick, hoops, pink background is something that would never be associated with Villa. Guns, women fighting, actions, those are all like definers of Villa that directly relate to his masculinity. So by deconstructing Villa's identity, I have allowed for the imagination of Villa's sexuality and gender behind closed doors, or a possibility of a gender revolution instead of the Mexican Revolution that Villa could have inflicted onto the Mexican population if times were different, and if LGBTQ plus language was more inclusive and accessible in the Spanish language. So the last piece I captured, then edited, is called Mariex Finds Love in the Lower Valley. So I captured this in the neighborhood I grew up in, the neighborhood I just talked about, in El Paso, Texas. So this one, I took Cisneros and Lopez's piece about La Virgen de Guadalupe, said earlier, and shaped La Virgen to this notion of, again, of putahood, movement, and gender. I wanted to capture La Virgen as an entity engaging in sacrilegious actions that would never be accepted. In the photo, as we can see, La Virgen contains masculine features, leaving room to question her gender, and is placed in a like rundown location with the play of color and lighting. For the clothing, I wanted to stick with her usual attire to make it known that it was La Virgen in this picture. In most pictures of La Virgen, she's covered up, leaving only her face and hands to be visible, which creates the illusion of a statue figure restricted in movement, only being able to present herself in what the church wants to see her as. This photo could be interpreted as something that would be considered as a low point, but it's the complete opposite of that. It's more of an opportunity for levied him to engage with her devotees in spaces other than at the altar or the church. So also we need to remember who levied him was pre-colonization. So La Virgen was Tonantzin, mother deity of fertility. So Juan Diego, an indigenous man, that was his Spanish name, was the one who saw La Virgen in her current figure. And so I think that the figure that we place now completely goes against of what she used to be represented as. So this is also like an ode to Tonantzin, you know, unraveling her like restrictions, and it's something that she also deserves. So as mentioned, as a queer Chicana feminist artist, I have always found it necessary to incorporate the self and political identity into the work I do. With my art and photography, I hope not to only inspire, but provide education to those who hold a malice attitude towards the queer, trans, Chicanx, Latinx community. Situations of ignorance are often fueled by the lack of education and exposure to work that critiques the normative everyday life. As Chicana feminism has pointed out, the idea of power over non-men has been instilled into us dating back to the conquest, meaning there is a heavy amount of work and labor that needs to be put forward. I strongly believe that certain work that reflects the Chicana feminist consciousness is necessary in the ongoing fight to liberating us from hegemonic power. Queer Chicanx feminists have created a methodology, as Sandoval calls it, methodology of the oppressed, using the oppositional consciousness that deflects violent colonial standards that have been long inflicted onto the community in the past and present. With a critical point of view, they have been able to adopt toxic traditional cultural values to reinvent them into ways that are palatable and functional within a colonized feminist framework. I hope to upkeep my art and photography and allow it to be fluid, keeping up with the battle to expose hegemony. I also hope for my work to grow and be able to share it with others through publications and more. Thank you. And I'm done.
Thank you, Pico. That was a great presentation. Lots to think about. So I'm going to open the floor. Is there any questions? Please throw them in the chat for Pico. Luis, do we have any on Facebook yet?
Yes, someone just asked if this will be available later to view, and the answer is yes.
Yes, it will be on Facebook for all to view after. Any questions? So people think of questions. I have a questions for you, Pico. You talk a lot about using this for in community spaces. How do you think we can include this more in academia as a means to sort of dismantle the toxic ivory tower?
So using art, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think it's hard because we are all in the ivory tower, and we all have this understanding of what we can and can't do, and whether or not the ivory tower can be dismantled in the first place, knowing what the ivory tower was originally intended for. So can you decolonize it to a certain extent? Can you critique it? You can critique it all you want. Can you completely change it? I don't, possibly not, but can you create something new that can reflect what you want? Yes.
Thank you. I love that. I think that notion of creating your own space is critical.
We have a question from Herman Ethan Larry, who's asking if this art will be available to view in person.
My art, if you follow me on Instagram, I have all my art on my website. So you can go ahead and see it there. I recently did an art show, but it was more so for doing testimonials, interviews, and photography with local mutual aid organizations. But currently, with the art that I displayed, no, you can't see it live because it's not in an art show, but you can see it online. But hopefully one day you'll be able to see it in an art show.
Let's see. So we have no more questions here. Luis, is there any more questions on Facebook?
No more questions on Facebook.
Okay. Well, thank you, Pico, for this great presentation, and thank you to all who can attend. If you were interested, please like and share it all over Facebook. We'd love to have more folks exposed to this great work from Pico. And I hope everybody has a great evening, a great weekend. Yes.
Damon, there's one more that just popped up just now. It says, how do people like me, Navajo, play a role in this?
That's really interesting and hard because I know that some people in the Chicanx community, Chicano community, identify as indigenous. I personally don't, but queering the cultural iconographies, it can be applied to anything. It's not necessarily just a framework that can be applied to, La Virgen and all that. And it also doesn't necessarily have to apply to cultural iconographies too, It can be applied to, concepts. It can be applied to language. So anything in your community that is seen as harmful towards, LGBTQ relatives, there's always going to be a way that you can take that, turn it into an artistic concept that incorporates, your queerness, your radical politics, that can really start creating, these conversations. Mm-hmm.
Perfecto. That was the last one.
Perfect. That's a great question. So, Pico, do you have any final words?
No.
Oh, perfect. Thank you again to everybody and have a great afternoon and evening.